Does this make sense to you? Scenario Fitting by Sceptikat, Part 10, Forgot to Factor in the Cost of the Lockdown, narrated by Andrew Mather. The cost of the lockdown. Action if acting in the interest of the population. Model lockdown consequences. Estimate and model the loss of life and quality of life costs to lockdown versus no lockdown scenarios. Share the estimates and rationale for policy choices with the public. UK government action. Ignore lockdown consequences. Such analysis was either not done or the results of it were not shared with the public. The cost of the lockdown. Unprecedented measures. Deliberately shutting down the economy is a measure so extreme that there is no precedent for it. Never done before, for any reason. The UK managed to achieve the highest coronavirus death rate in the world, coupled with the worst damage to the economy. That's quite a feat. So what analysis went into producing this outcome? It's hard to see what analysis could have possibly justified such awful policy choices. It appears, though, that such an analysis was not even performed. The costs were not weighed up. The cost-benefit was not considered at any point. How is this possible? The UK economy has grown on average 2 to 2.5% a year since World War II and 1.5% to 2% a year in the last 10 years. Last year it grew by 1.4%. Contrast this with the minus 20.4% decline in the GDP in April alone. 10 to 15 years of growth wiped out in 1 month, and this is just the beginning. This isn't about money. The health of the economy translates directly into employment, quality of public services, healthcare, education, infrastructure, mitigating poverty. It also translates into quality of life. And now we're facing an economic decline not seen since the Middle Ages. It's not the rich who pay the price. They are unaffected or even benefit. An impoverished economy means mass poverty and mass unemployment, stress and despair on a mass scale, lives of hopelessness devoid of meaning, poor health care, increasing mortality from all causes, education failing our children who face meagre prospects of creating a stable life and building a family when they grow up. The economic devastation caused by the lockdown has consequences that were no harder to forecast than it was to model coronavirus deaths. The government made a decision that is causing an unprecedented destruction of people's lives, a decision without any historic precedent, and they didn't bother to estimate the costs and the likely consequences and to weigh them up against any expected benefits. The real task of government is managing trade-offs. Is it difficult to model the economic impact of policy measures? No, there's an army of economists and financial analysts doing it as a day job. Is it difficult to model the social consequences? No, plenty of think tanks and social scientists. Did they not have the resources to afford a few models and analysts? Well, if they can afford 100 billion for furlough, they surely could have paid for a few consultants. So why were the likely consequences of the lockdown not considered? Why? The financial and economic consequences of the lockdown aren't just an impoverishment of the population and of public services. The lockdown has targeted small businesses specifically while benefiting multinational corporations. It is a de facto reallocation of wealth from small business owners and the middle class to large corporations and the wealthy. Some businesses have closed already. Others, such as restaurants, are operating with a new set of rules that make it impossible for them to remain solvent. And as the demand for welfare spending increases sharply, while the economic destruction means vastly lower tax revenues, inevitably large numbers will slip into desperate poverty, even starvation. Once the furlough scheme ends, many will lose their jobs as companies will not be in a solid financial position or will not have a market to sell to. Much of the economic and financial impact of the lockdowns will materialise with a time lag. Business defaults impact their suppliers, lenders, customers, domino style. Property values collapse under the weight of unpaid rent and reduced demand. As supply chains break down and businesses fail, scarcity of goods, even essential goods such as food, is a possibility. And of course, the extraordinary money printing of the Bank of England and the likely price increases for essential goods as the shutdown of the economy causes supply shocks can quite conceivably lead to hyperinflation and financial collapse, i.e. utter chaos. Weimar Republic 2.0. The social consequences of the lockdown were not difficult to predict either. Economic destruction and mass unemployment lead to well understood social outcomes, and with the loss of jobs and the devastation of small businesses, the middle class is decimated and pushed towards poverty, with a banana republic style gap developing between rich and poor. The stress of social isolation, fear, and the poverty and unemployment induced hopelessness and desperation cause a spike in domestic violence, child abuse, addictions, self-harm and suicides. The UK's largest domestic abuse charity reports a 66% rise in calls to its helpline and a 700% increase in visitors to its website. Education is another casualty with long-term consequences. All of these outcomes could easily be foreseen and their likely magnitude forecast. Quality adjusted life years type metrics could be used to aggregate and compare. If they were truly working for the good of mankind, all of these very well-known factors would have been included. The average age of those dying of COVID is in the 80s, and the vast majority were already suffering from serious illnesses. Any life years lost type calculation would have advised against these unprecedented, irrational lockdowns. Even more so if we factor in the colossal long-term decline in quality of life as a consequence of the lockdowns. But if we restrict ourselves purely to number of lives lost, even that very narrow assessment suggests that the lives lost due to the lockdown outstrip the number of lives lost due to COVID. Even though the government did not care to look into this, experts have warned already back in March. The lockdown deaths have already been mounting, see Part 9, but much of it will occur in future. Deaths due to worse health outcomes caused by deprivation and poverty, deaths of despair, deaths caused by the impoverished healthcare infrastructure. There is a strong correlation between life expectancy and the economy, and the NHS policy of cancelling and delaying diagnostics and treatments will make the UK lockdown death count even worse. Add to this the deaths caused by the lockdown, mandated isolation, and the resulting stress. The already dramatic deterioration of mental health across the population is another ticking time bomb that is sure to translate into further mortality from addictions, suicide, and violence. In addition to the deaths and destruction being caused in the UK by the lockdown in Western countries also have a serious knock-on effect on the Third World. Our governments don't bat an eyelid at their policies pushing tens or even hundreds of millions of the Third World into starvation. The world has never faced a hunger emergency like this, experts say. The government never communicated about assessing the costs and consequences of the lockdown. Where was the Neil Ferguson equivalent with a model on the expected costs, loss of life and quality of life consequences of the lockdown? It appears some in government were concerned, but Matt Hancock put that concern swiftly to bed, saying it was not part of our internal analysis. There were several alternatives to the unprecedented, devastating lockdown. The vulnerable could have been protected at a fraction of the cost, leaving the livelihoods of the majority intact. Why were alternative solutions not modelled? Democratic accountability dictates the government should have explained the analysis supporting the lockdown policy, and the arguments and reasoning for the lockdown should have been exposed to public scrutiny. No such communication took place, either because there was nothing to talk about as no proper assessment was ever done, or if there was, then the conclusions from the assessment must have suggested that the lockdowns were the wrong policy, and so the results were not shared with the public. In summary, such an unprecedented and monumentally destructive decision leading to economic devastation, terrible social consequences, significant loss of life as well as loss of quality life for many should have been based on a very thorough analysis of the alternatives and an assessment of the likely outcomes. Not to have done so is irresponsible beyond comprehension. Yet it appears that either no such assessment was done or the results of the assessment did not justify the lockdown. Sceptikat says this makes no sense. Join us for part 11, Doubling Down on Every Mistake. Thank you for watching. You can reach me, Sceptikat, at sceptikat@peerlessreads.com, Andrew and Kat see that, or privately at kat@sceptikat.com.